My name is Joe Drury, and this is Winter is Coming, a conversation about Game of Thrones. What we're going to do is, the goal here is to have a conversation about the show, about the books, and to try and have a conversation that is kind of critical, analytical, rather than listing all the things that we love about Game of Thrones. I'm sure that will come up, and there's plenty of room for fans here. Have the door. But yeah, we're trying to analyze this show, find out, to think about why it's become this sort of global popular cultural phenomenon, why it's so popular, what is the power that it has, and what's the source of that power, what the show is about. I mean, I've been watching it for many years, as you all have too, and I don't think I've ever fully articulated to myself what it is about. So it might be interesting to think about that. What's its kind of what are its central themes and concerns? What is radical, challenging, difficult, shocking about the show? I think a lot of its power comes from its sort of shock value, and we might want to talk about that too. Why does it feel, to what extent does it feel kind of realistic or relevant to the world we live in today? Of course, it's set in an imaginary universe, but it seems also to speak to our own world too. And maybe it can speak more directly to our own concerns precisely because it's sort of set in a fantasy one. We might want to think about that too. So what I'm going to do is introduce you to my fellow English department professors, Brooke Hunter and Travis Foster. By the way, there are handouts at the back also next to the food about the English major. We're all from the English department. This event is to give you a demonstration of the kinds of things we do in English classes partly. So help yourself to the handouts as you grab the food. So I guess I would just say a few opening remarks, and I'm going to hand over to my colleagues, and then once we've sort of said a few things, we'll open up discussion. We're obviously excited to hear what you guys have to say and come out hear your theories about what this show is about and why you think it's interesting to talk about. So I guess from what one way to think about this show is an example of what critics call arc TV, right? This is a show that has very complicated, character-driven narratives, multi-layered plots that require quite a lot of attention to keep track of. And rather surprisingly, I think, this is actually quite a relatively new phenomenon in television, and I think it has a lot to do with the fact that for the first time really ever, writers can now write plots and narratives with the expectation that the audience will watch each show in order, one after the other, right? When I was growing up on TV, watching TV, you couldn't really do that, right? If you happened to be out one evening, you missed the show, there was no way of going back and watching it. It just wasn't possible. You just have to pick it up, and hope you didn't miss anything important the next week. But now we can sit down and not only watch them in order, but watch them, several episodes in one day. How many people have binge watched several episodes? Yeah, right. So that's what we do now. This is a new phenomenon, and I think it makes possible new kinds of TV, new kinds of television shows, new kinds of narratives that have many of the qualities that we associate with different art forms, like, for example, the novel. I think that's perhaps the most obvious connection. They have the kind of extensive narrative arcs of epic fiction. And I think that has a lot to do with these new technologies. I think it also has to do with the internet too. How many of you guys have been online to investigate theories about Jon and Daenerys? How many of you contributed to these forums? Oh, you have?
YouTube comments.
YouTube comments, okay, good. So, and I think part of the complexity of Game of Thrones as a show, the sort of complexity of its plots, the sheer number of characters we're expected to keep track of, I certainly can't remember the names of all of them, is made possible, I suspect, by the ability of us to sort of go online, type in Targaryen, and then read a long account of all the different characters, all the different plots, look at the family tree. I was just looking at the family tree of all the different houses. All of that is I think, is as essential to sort of enjoying the show, in fact, as watching it individual episodes. So I think it's about a fantasy world, it's about a pseudo-medieval world, Brooks will talk about this in a moment, but it's enabled, I think, by the particular kind of historical moment that we're living in. The kind of immersive, absorptive qualities of it are enabled by this moment. And I suspect, well, yeah, I'll leave it there. So I'm going to hand over to Brooke now. Brooke is a medievalist, scholar of medieval literature, and one of the interesting things about Game of Thrones is its let's say medievalism.
Okay, I'm going to come stand up here so I can start the video. But my name is Brooke Hunter, and as Dr. Drury said, I teach and study medieval literature in the English department. And so Game of Thrones is really popular among scholars who study the Middle Ages. There are a number of scholarly articles and even scholarly books that have come out that talk about the fictional world of Game of Thrones and its relation to the actual medieval world and medieval history. And in fact, maybe as some of you know, George R.R. Martin has even discussed how his own reading of medieval and early modern history, but particularly medieval history, contributed to his depiction of Westeros and Essos. And I'll come out and say I have only seen the show. I haven't read the books, so I'm going to do my best to kind of convince.
How many people have read the books? Okay.
Okay, so we've got,
yeah.
You're a minority, but you're a more knowledgeable minority. Let me see if I can get this up here just so it's ready to go. Okay. So the worlds of Westeros and Essos are obviously fantasy. Real medieval history, as we all know, doesn't contain dragons or White Walkers or wargs, but they're clearly designed to play off of modern ideas about what it might have been like to live during the Middle Ages. And if just we're thinking about what that means, when we talk about the medieval period, we're talking about the period between about 500 and 1500. In fact, many of the parts of the cultural makeup of Westeros and Essos that we see in Game of Thrones is really a mix of the medieval and the early modern. So the early modern we sometimes call the Renaissance. So for example, the sort of really expansive shipping routes that we see from the spice masters in Qarth, those are early modern. The sort of large-scale slave ownership that we see, that's early modern. The huge global financial institution that we see in the Iron Bank, that's more early modern. So it really is, we think of this as like a medieval type setting, but there are many ways in which it's not medieval. I think what really makes Game of Thrones seem primarily medieval is what it doesn't have. And so that includes the lack of a printing press. So the world of Game of Thrones is a manuscript culture that's sort of indicatively medieval. We think of the printing press as something that is modern. So we can see that, for example, when we see Samwell Tarly in the Citadel sort of, burdened down by the huge amount of books that he has to copy painstakingly by hand. That is sort of an indicatively medieval part of the Game of Thrones culture. The second aspect of Game of Thrones that I think is really indicatively medieval that is sort of something that it lacks is gunpowder. So Game of Thrones is a world in which there are no guns and there are no cannons. And so the battlefield scenes that we get are based on sort of man-to-man sword fighting, lance fighting. They have something called wildfire, as you guys know.
That's wildfire, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and that's like Greek fire. There's sort of this mysterious Greek fire that they talk about in crusading battles, for example. I don't know exactly what Greek fire is. I think some people who are more attuned to the military specifics do. But nonetheless, the lack of gunpowder really changes the military landscape. And so Game of Thrones sort of close fighting, the melee fighting that we see in the Battle of the Bastards, that is something that's sort of more indicatively medieval, and it begins to change as we move into the early modern period and the movement of gunpowder into the West. Let's see. So like I said, one thing that I think also is indicative of the medieval of Game of Thrones that is more positive is this vision that we have of the idea of the political struggle between the houses as through the image of a wheel. Where are we? How do I get it to do that? Slideshow? From the beginning. Okay, so what is the important point that I want you to take from it? We have the two actually they're GIFs. That works out well. Didn't even plan that. So what is important here? We have Daenerys says Lannister, Targaryen, Baratheon, Stark, Tyrell. They're all just spokes on a wheel. This one's on top, then that one's on top, and on it spins, crushing those on the ground. And Tyrion says, it's a beautiful dream, stopping the wheel. You're not the first person who's ever dreamt it. Daenerys says, I'm not going to stop the wheel. I'm going to break the wheel. I can't do it in her sort of great voice. But this image of sort of political struggle as a wheel in which in which the political opponents are either on the top of the wheel or on the bottom being crushed, is an indicatively medieval concept that is, you can see in this image right here, of what's called, you don't have to move, the Wheel of Fortune, right? So you know the game show The Wheel of Fortune? It's actually medieval, from this medieval trope. You see this image throughout the Middle Ages. This one happens to be from the 13th century from a book about vices. And what we have here then, if you can kind of see, is a wheel. And on the top is a man who is crowned, is a king, and it says above it in Latin, regno, which means I reign. Over here we have a guy who's like, his crown is falling off. On the side it says regnavi, which means I have reigned, or I did reign. On the bottom you have like a guy who's not wearing any clothes, who's like getting crushed in the mud. And it says sum sino regno, I am without reign. And over here you have a guy who is coming up the wheel, about to ascend to sort of the top position, and it says I will reign. So this image of sort of the wheel of kingship, of political power turning like a wheel is a very common one in the Middle Ages. The only thing about the wheel that Daenerys maybe doesn't know is that the one thing about the wheel is that it never stops turning. So you can't break the wheel, it just doesn't stop. You might be king today, but you're going to be down in the muck tomorrow.
What if you have dragons?
Well, okay, so I gave you also this title from Game of Thrones over here, which is in the opening credits. And you can see the image of the wheel kind of repeated with the different sigils from the different houses displayed. And I like to think that this is like a hint for what's coming, right? Because what do we have here? Who are our different sigils? We have the stag, which is House Baratheon. What position are they in on the wheel?
On the way down.
They're on the way down, right, to I am without reign. We have House Lannister, which used to be on the top, we can see, but is also on the way down. And who's on the way up? Targaryen and Stark, right? So we have the dragon and the wolf. And I like to think that this is like a clue, like this is what's going to happen, right? It's going to be the Targaryen, but who's ultimately going to reign? This is my pet theory. Jon Snow, probably. I guess he's a Targaryen.
He's a Targaryen.
Yeah, so maybe it's Sansa. I don't know. Spoilers, yeah. In any case, so this is just one example of how Game of Thrones actually, is sort of medieval-y. But what I kind of want to point us to today is the idea of medievalism. And so that's sort of a technical term for the study, not necessarily of the historical Middle Ages, but of sort of fantasies about, from like pop culture of any age after the Middle Ages. So how cultures past the Middle Ages think about and depict what the Middle Ages were like. So we can think about the medievalism of Shakespeare's history plays, Shakespeare who wrote during the early modern period, and wrote history plays about the 100 Years' War, War of the Roses, medieval conflicts, to present them in a certain way for a political purpose during his time. We can think about the medievalism of the Victorian era, in which people in the 19th century became obsessed with knights and ladies, with King Arthur stories, in novels like Ivanhoe, which are about sort of celebrating English Anglo-Saxon heritage, or we can think about why, right now, we are sort of seeing this resurgence of medievalism in the interest in Game of Thrones. We can see it elsewhere too, which we can talk about maybe later.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course.
So what do you think is distinctive about this medievalism as opposed to, say, the medievalism of Shakespeare or the medievalism of the Victorians?
So
what is Martin and the showrunners, what are they specifically interested in about the Middle Ages, which is different from those?
I think it's like in part, we can open this up for everybody, right? Like what is it about this version of the Middle Ages that is interesting? I think this version is about excess. I think a question to ask is, do we feel different from the world of Game of Thrones that we see? Is it something that we feel better than, that we want to sort of exclude from ourselves? Like, we're not like that. That was a past that is gone, that we no longer act like that. Or are we nostalgic about the world of Game of Thrones? And we think that was a time when things were better, when men were men, and it's something that we want to go back to. And I think answering those two questions can kind of help us think about our relationship to Game of Thrones. Because the idea that I want you guys, and I'll pass it off to you guys so you can talk, to think about is, what does Game of Thrones and its vision of the medieval period say, not about the past, but about what our culture wants to think about ourselves and our relation to this supposed past time that we are either different from or nostalgic to return to?
Great questions.
That's great.
Thank you, Brooke.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Travis Foster, and I'm actually a 19th century Americanist, so I don't know why Joe asked me to be on this panel.
Because you've read the books.
And he said at the very beginning that he doesn't want us to talk as fans, but that's really my only relationship to the show or the books. So I'm Team Arya, which doesn't mean I'm anti-Sansa. I want to go drinking with Tyrion, and I'm terrified of zombie dragons. But I will say just a couple things. So I'm going to talk about fantasy as a genre overall, in part because I read a lot of it, I really enjoy it. And then I'm going to think about two ways that critics and both critics in the kind of academy, but also critics just in blogs and forums online are thinking about and talking about Game of Thrones now that I think present actually really interesting questions about why we watch it and then what its politics are. So, some boring categorizations. There's a critic named Farah Mendelssohn, who's one of the few people actually within literary criticism, within English departments, take fantasy really seriously. And she divides fantasy into 4 separate categories. And I'm going to start with the 3 that are not Game of Thrones and then end with the one that is Game of Thrones. So there's the Portal Quest, which is like the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where there is a doorway that connects our world with some other fantastic magical world, and you can go back and forth in between. Then there is the Intrusive, where there are these fantastic elements that break into our world, and that's also kind of magical realism, right? Where you're walking along in our world, and then all of a sudden there's something that's magical, that's unexpected, irrational, that you can't explain, that is now a part of your reality. And then there's this one that she calls the Intrusive, where...
Oh, hang on, we just had Intrusive.
Sorry. The liminal, thank you, Joe. And that's where magic may or may not be the explanation for what's going on. And those are really fun. And then there is, right, the one that is Game of Thrones, which is immersive, and it's sometimes called high fantasy, and that's where the entire world is set in a fantastic universe, where there are dragons, where there are giants, where it is not at all the world that we live in now, although there are familiar elements. So as an immersive fantasy, I think one way we might think of Game of Thrones is why, as such a popular show, does it produce in us this desire for this other world? And I think that question and that desire for the fantasy that is Game of Thrones is one reason that critics and viewers find the questions about the gender politics, the sexual politics, the racial politics of the show so pressing. So are the rape scenes, right, the really kind of graphic and extreme rape scenes in Game of Thrones, are they expressions of a male unconscious desire, right? Is that part of what's driving the show's popularity? Are the brutal revenge scenes, the sustained torture scenes, the scenes of kind of abusive pedagogy, right, where Arya has to learn how to be a person of many faces through being beaten up repeatedly, are those desires for, or like expressions of our repressed desire for a kind of mastery, complete mastery over others? And then we can think of the end of season 3, where there's this sort of paternalistic benevolence that Daenerys has over all of these non-white slaves that she's freed. Are these kind of enactments of the repressed white desire for racial hierarchy, and for a paternalistic racial hierarchy rather than a brutal racial hierarchy, but a racial hierarchy nonetheless. And then also in these scenes of kind of complete, right, there's so many scenes of complete subjugation of another person. Are we identifying with the powerful or with the victim in those scenes? And then I think that's also just one of the set of questions, like what is it about this show's violence that we find so, and I'm speaking personally, irrepressible, right? I just want more of it. So that's one set of questions. And the other set of questions has to do with the politics of the show. And I mean, are we going towards an ending where we've made Westeros great again and restored the status quo, and not overturned any of the kind of fundamental things that are crushing the powerless? Or are we going towards a Westeros where there is a kind of fundamental upending of the way things were, so that those who are at the bottom do have a way of getting to the top? And I think about this mainly with what I'll say is my kind of profound disappointment that Jon Snow is not a bastard.
Right.
I really, really, really want Jon Snow, right? In his rise to power, in his goodness, in his intelligence, in his kind of power as a swordsman, I want him to be a bastard, because if he's a bastard, then he's overturning this this bloodline wherein power is passed from generation to generation to generation, and all those who are not in power have no access to gaining power. But he's not, right? He is not only not a bastard, but he's potentially the rightful heir to the Iron Throne, although his being the rightful heir to the Iron Throne is only predicated upon his being a male, against and above his aunt, Daenerys, who also has a claim to the Iron Throne. So are we coming to an ending in Season 8, in anticipating Season 8, where Jon Snow is going to come out on top and everything will be right because everything will be as it was before, and all of the power systems will still be in place? That's one of the questions I have.
Well, those are some big questions. So, yeah, I mean, I think...
Oh, sorry, I have
Yeah.
one more thing to say.
Oh, okay.
With profound apologies, I was only able to get a 14-year-old babysitter tonight, and her parents do not want her out too late, so I will be leaving early. And it's not because I'm not interested in talking about Game of Thrones. I infinitely am. So you can come to me afterwards, and we will. But I do have to leave at 8:15.
So if you have any
I apologize
questions,
of that.
so if you have any questions for Travis, now's the time to ask them. Yeah, we have a question in the back.
I think you point to a really interesting question that also really can be addressed to almost every piece of horror terror literature since the dawn of time, or Shakespeare, that they seem so subversive and, revolutionary, but when it comes down to it, boy, is there a lot of conservative, right there, restoration of power to the exact conservative choice. So I just think that raises a very, what's going on? Why is it pretend to be subversive and end up being so conservative, or is it?
Why do we feel that it's subversive? What is subversive about this show? Why is it different from other kinds of shows? I mean,
Why do you guys watch the show?
yeah, when you watch the show.
Like, what do you like about it? Dragons? Okay.
Yes.
But there have been dragons on TV before.
No,
right?
Not like this.
They're very good dragons. So it's the special effects.
Just call it out, yeah.
After you invest the first 30 hours, there's no going back.
Okay.
It's a sunk cost sort of thing.
So, but I mean, Travis used the phrase immersive, and that's part of it, right?
Yeah, there's a depth to the show. It's not just a horizontal following, but like you can really go into, and not just the show, but the books, right? Like you can
The
look
books,
at
the
all
blogs,
the Targaryen.
the
It's
family
like,
trees. Yeah.
It's like Lord of the Rings, right? It has a deep history that I think is really satisfying.
And can I ask a question about this? How many of you watch it alone, just yourself, or with a group? How many with a group?
Oh.
How many alone?
Oh, alone.
How many of you, when you watch alone, feel like you have to talk about it with somebody else?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys should all watch it together. Exchange.
I mean, I think. I mean, Travis has already touched on the horrendous violence of the show, a lot of which is sort of sexual, and I think that surely must have something to do with what we find shocking and different about it, right? It just, at any opportunity, it just goes there, right? It never shirks a shock.
I think that's
Very
really
good.
changed over the course of the seasons, though. Like it used to be, any conversation that was going on, there would be like boobs in the shot, right?
Sex
and now you
position,
can and now
yeah.
the boobs have gone way down, and you
They
can like
have.
have like long conversations in which there are no naked women.
Right.
So
Although the
it-
violence is still.
The violence is
yeah.
still there.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think to that point, as interesting as the show is on its own in each individual episode, I think a lot of it has to do with figuring out what happens, where it ends, and I think
Yeah.
the big difference about the show is compared to a lot of fantasy, like Lord of the Rings, is there's no like inherent light and inherent dark.
Yes.
There's a lot of
Yes.
like gray area, and you see redeeming virtues in almost every character, and you see negatives in every character. So it's not like we know the good guys are going to end up on top kind of thing. It's like, how is this gonna play out, and it's
Yeah.
like I don't think anybody really.
Yeah, there's a real uncertainty generated by the way they just kill off main characters.
And that,
At any moment.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the distinction between this and a lot of fantasy. A lot of fantasy tends to be intensely Manichaean, right? There is good and there is bad. And I just think about the end of season 1, like, why does Jon Stark get executed? He gets executed because he warns Cersei what he's going to do, because he wants her to save her children. So he's trying to do good, and it's precisely because he tries to do good that he gets killed. And I think that moral ambiguity is absolutely, like,
But I would say, like,
powerful.
does that make it more realistic? I mean, does
Right.
that make us feel like it's more like real history, that anyone could die at any moment?
Is that part of what's compelling about it? This sort of impression of realism generated by the
And dragons.
Yeah, but I mean, even the dragons are very realistic, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say yes, especially since like I feel physical anxiety when I watch the
Right.
show.
Yes.
Right.
And like I feel like that's kind of like in real life too. Like you never know what's
Right.
gonna happen.
Right.
You know? So.
Right. I think the violence may also be connected to your question, Brooke, about what kind of medievalism the show gives us. I feel like as opposed to the Victorian medievalism, where there are battles, but it's very kind of,
They're different.
there's lots of heraldry and it's knights running around and it's quite a stately medieval period. Whereas this seems a very kind of bleak, violent, grim, cruel, sadistic Middle Ages.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that it's interesting that in this moment in sort of American history, where there's a lot of uncertainty, right, about what's going to happen next, and are we going to be, like, is the nuclear war going to start, what's going on, that we're drawn to shows that are similarly sort of where we're sort of unmoored as to what's going to happen. I don't know because it's not a refuge to go into. I mean, it is.
Yeah.
It's an escapist refuge, but at the same time, it is sort of, we don't know what's going to happen, right?
Questions? Responses? Yeah.
Just to that, I think in terms of the realistic characters, the thing like with other fantasy, like it kind of appeals to like your hopes in terms of like we wish we were like Frodo
Yeah.
or some of
Yeah.
these like magnanimous characters, whereas the show like particularly like a Jaime Lannister
Yeah.
or a Tyrion are people who like can very easily be identified with, not just on like a oh, I wish I was like them kind of level. Like you can definitely see like the mistakes they make, and also their times when they're heroic. And I think whereas other type of fantasy succeeds in that sense of kind of appealing to our wishes, this succeeds in like a much more kind of grounded attachment kind of way, where like those characters can easily be us.
Yeah, it's sort of deliberately unwish fulfilling, isn't it? Deliberately kind of pulls the rug out underneath our wishes. We wish Robert Stark and Talisa and Heavy
Right.
after. Instead, she gets a stab in her
Or
gut.
it makes us wish for things that we otherwise might be uncomfortable with. Like, I don't know how many of you guys are like shipping Daenerys and Jon, right? But I mean, so at the beginning of the show, we were sort of disgusted by the incest between the Lannister twins. And then at the end of the show this season, I think a lot of people were
Incest.
sort of like, yay, finally they got together, even though it's a nephew and
Even
an
though
aunt.
they're related.
And then you have to feel sort of like weird about your desire for a relationship.
I mean, that's surely very subversive. Having
Yeah.
the heroine and the hero have incestuous sex. I mean,
And everyone was like, yay, finally!
what the? That doesn't happen on most TV shows.
It's been an interesting trajectory with the incest. Yeah.
Yeah.
Henry Douglas.
So just kind of jumping off of that, I think for me, the show and the books have always been about character.
Right.
And there's two specific things that I think really connect us to these characters. And one is this kind of social environment that surrounds Westeros, where everybody has a reputation that precedes them. So you kind of always know, who someone is. Like Jaime Lannister's the Kingslayer, and everybody kind of has these nicknames that precede them. And the other thing is this idea of family, where
Mhm.
we get grouped into the family that we're in. And so the show to me has always been about these characters trying to prove themselves different than how other people see them. For example, Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, I think it's so great that the first two seasons he's so vilified, and especially in the first two books, you don't read from his perspective until the third book. And then once you do, you find out, why he killed the Mad King to save all these people. And especially for Jon Snow, like trying to get these people, trying to get the wildlings like north of the wall, just doing all these things that he's not supposed to be doing because he wants to break this idea of what the Lord Commander is supposed to be for the good of the realm. And I think we connect with that so much because we always have like, we want to be individualistic from our families and not necessarily be looped into what our fathers have done before us. As I'm sure Dani doesn't want to be associated with her father. She wants her own reign, and also just the social environments that we grow up with. We all get reputations that precede us that may not be accurate, so we kind of want to develop our own.
And some of the most deadly dangerous characters in the show / book are also often the characters who are most sort of devoted to family, right? Think of Tywin Lannister, who's sort of built up this immense family and this immense power. He's totally brutal and savage and ruthless as well. And the complete opposite to the character that we probably most identify in that family, which is Tyrion. I mean, I think another interestingly subversive thing about it is the extent. I mean, they've also put a dwarf at the center of the story. I mean, I think in some ways the last two seasons has kind of moved away from Tyrion a bit, so that sort of Daenerys and Jon Snow are beginning to be the central characters. But for the first 4 or 5 seasons, I don't know about anybody else, but I was Team Tyrion. I felt like he was the sort of heart of the show, and that's again not something that you will find in any other TV show. And if you think of all the characters who are sort of disabled in some way, they're very often the characters who we end up sort of connecting to. And in fact, Jaime Lannister, who is the character who probably has changed most in the course of the series, the critical moment, right? So when he loses his hand, his sword fighting hand. So I guess I often wonder what's going on there. And Jon Snow is a hero till like a couple of weeks ago, we all thought he was a bastard. I agree, I'm very disappointed by that. I'm secretly hoping that he will still turn out to be a bastard somehow. He's sort of, there's a moment early on where him and Tyrion have a moment where they both sort of bond over the fact that they're sort of marginal characters who are sort of discriminated against. And then you can think of Bran, who obviously is crippled at the beginning of the show and then acquires this incredible sort of foresight, supernatural powers, and I could, there are others. Hodor, right, the greatest hero of all. There's something. I think that tells us something about the values of this show, right? About who Martin values, the kinds of virtues and qualities that the show values, which are again very different from traditional fantasy, right? Where if you think of Lord of the Rings. Well, actually, there's some similarities there. They're all kind of hobbits in a way, right, in Game of Thrones. But there are sort of traditional heroic figures in Lord of the Rings. But all the traditional heroic figures in Game of Thrones are villains, pretty much.
Were there other questions or comments? Or I saw a few hands up, but
yeah.
Going back to the thing about family, I think it's interesting that there's such an emphasis on where you come from as a family, there's no way there can be a good Lannister, just look at Tywin. And it's so weird because Tywin's the one who turned his family around after his dad pretty much ruined the Lannister name. And all it took was, slaughtering some other Westerland lords. That's
right. Yeah.
It's so easy for someone to change the reputation of their family, at least in a certain social circle.
Yeah, and that's one of the sort of odd things about the show is that it's a very kind of rule-governed society in a way. There are all these sort of...
I mean, it's a very feudal, hierarchical feudal
exactly.
society, right? And I wonder, I was the last speaker who was saying that what we like about the show is seeing people kind of go against their family.
Right.
I wonder if part of the pleasure of the show is also the strength of familial bonds, right? That we look at this feudal culture in which family means everything, and we sort of, it's not a Kardashian type family, but sort of a similar, there's a similar pleasure there in that sort of tight-knit family unit, which is very much, it's not anti-American, but it's sort of against those individualistic impulses that you were talking about, right? So I think you're right, the individualistic impulses that we as Americans tend to celebrate, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, are absolutely there, but part of the pleasure of the show is also sort of the ways in which family, set in stone, the family that you have is the place that you have in society.
I mean, the sort of individualistic, Horatio Alger figure, sort of pulling yourself up by a bootstrap character, is surely Lord Baelish, right? He's the guy that talks about
a villain.
chaos being a ladder, right? He's the one that's trying to kind of rise to the top. And yeah, he's a total villain, right?
Yeah, he's horrible.
He's not a sympathetic
When
character at all.
Arya
Has
cut
no,
him, that was awesome.
but he has no loyalty to family, right? He's
Right.
he's a kind of lone wolf. Okay, wolf is the wrong word, but he's a loner and is untrustworthy and kind of you don't know where he's coming from as a result. Whereas at least the other villains, Tywin, Ramsay Bolton, Joffrey, you kind of know what they're up to. They're trying to dominate you.
Ramsay Bolton is also similarly like a social climber, right? Like someone
Right,
who
'cause he's a
wants to
bastard.
transcend his
He's like
his
Edmund,
bastard
yeah.
status. Yeah, and I wonder like those moments where we see like, oh, the little lord, Bran being such a good lord and like being good to these like older men. Do we sort of celebrate those moments as those moments of like really strict like rank
Yeah.
order, which like in America we maybe should like don't
Winterfell is
naturally
kind of like the
celebrate.
Shire in that respect.
Yeah,
This sort of
absolutely.
nostalgic,
So-
idealized, sort of pseudo-feudal
Absolutely.
medieval society. Evan, yeah.
I was going to say, I'm curious about what's going to happen with family because are the Starks, the remaining Starks, all going to get together? Right? This season, what the show did was suggest at least that Arya might be against Sansa and create that kind of problem, which turned out not to be a problem. But in lots of other family stories, even though there's Tywin hates Tyrion. Tyrion kills Tywin. Cersei couldn't hate anybody more than she hates Tyrion.
Yeah.
So family can mean love and connectedness, but can also mean destroying everybody. And Cersei destroys her own family, including the sons she loves, which includes Tommen. Baelish is trying to create a family. The one remaining person who has no family, and I'm curious what's going to happen to him, is Varys.
Right.
Yeah.
And Varys can't have a family.
That's another.
And Varys is the parallel
disabled
to
character, yeah.
Lord Baelish. So if it's going to really break the wheel, I don't think it's going to happen. But it would be Varys taking control.
The eunuch's going to take
He would-
over.
The eunuch who really has nothing, who manipulated everything to get here, and in the books does even more. He would be the person who's behind it all, but I don't think it's going to happen because the show has made him less of a character. And even the things
Yeah.
he was great at before, like being the Lord of Whispers, he knew where everything was going on. Now Qyburn can do the same kind of things, which makes you wonder what was so great about Varys if anybody can do it.
So you're Team Varys.
Yeah, but he's been undercut this year, so I don't know what's going to happen.
Any other questions, comments? I mean, I kind of think that. Yeah, is that a hand? No, it was a lean.
Lean.
I mean, we tend to think of the show as being kind of gritty, real, right? And that's part of its appeal. But isn't there something kind of gratuitously sadistic about a lot of it? Like, I think in particular of is it season 3 or season 4 where basically Ramsay Bolton spends the whole season torturing Theon? I mean, is that what the Middle Ages was like? I also drew up a list of all the characters. All the characters who died in the show in the space of what it is, 10 years.
Yeah.
Very rich aristocratic people weren't dying at that rate in medieval Europe. I
No.
mean, they just weren't.
I mean, how many of you guys have seen Pulp Fiction?
Medieval on your ass.
So yeah, exactly. There's like a great moment where a character who's about to get revenge on someone who has treated him horribly says, "I'm going to get medieval on you,"
Yeah.
right? And he's going to torture the guy. And so medieval
The
to
gimp.
us means like torturing people. So there's this sense in the modern era that medieval is synonymous with torture. That's something that's really interesting that I think we see in Game of Thrones.
And in fact,
That's-
of course,
I mean, yeah.
there's probably as much and probably more torture going on now than there was.
Yeah, and I
in
think
the
a lot of
Middle Ages.
the innovations in I mean, they were torturing people in the Middle Ages, but a lot of those innovations happened in the early modern period, I think, as opposed to in the Middle Ages. But there was a hand, I think. Was there? Come back to stuff that you guys want to talk about. Like, what are you interested in the show? Moments that you have questions about or just are interested in?
Yeah.
Well, I just think, well, talking about like what makes the show great, I think the greatest testament to the show is that, and the books, is that we're talking about how, especially from a character point of view, how realistic it is, and to be able to talk about how realistic it is in a world with zombie dragons and White Walkers, and all these fantastical elements, I think is like a pretty amazing balance to achieve. And people, like this season in particular, have been complaining about like the time discontinuity and things like that, and people kind of counter with, well, in a show this fantastical, like you have a problem with that. And I think the reason people do have a problem with it is because the show has kind of set the ground that it really
That's
is.
not a good enough response. I agree.
That it really is like this, and I don't have a huge problem with it just from a storytelling point of view, but that it really is like a realistic world that we can kind of associated with that just has a little extra in it. And I think that it's able to kind of achieve that balance is one of the things that makes it so great. Because personally for me, like I don't love the fantasy elements so much. Like season 1 was my favorite just because of all of the kind of political maneuvering, and it was such like a personable, interconnected season among its characters. But it still hasn't really lost that, even though it's been we have 3 dragons and we have all this amazing.
I mean, arguably, you could say that actually fantasy or fantastical, supernatural stories are the stories that demand the most realism, right? Whereas you can put on a sitcom about anybody's everyday life, and there's no demand to be realistic. But when you're trying to convince people that dragons exist and there are White Walkers and there are zombies, that's when you really have to, develop the arts of realism. Yeah.
Just jumping onto that, I think what's so great is that we experience these like fantastical elements with the characters themselves, because I feel the same way in the first season and the first book. We read about the dragons and we read about the White Walkers and things like that, and we, along with like Ned Stark and all these other people, are like, yeah, this is just like, I don't believe that this actually exists in this world, because it's so grounded, and the story itself is so much about these characters, struggling for power, that we're like, there's, like, it's not going to be about White Walkers and dragons and things like that. That by the end of the book in the first series, when you see the dragons, you're like, oh man, it's the same as everybody else. It's the first kind of reaction that you get when you see these dragons. Like, I didn't think I was going to actually see dragons. No one else thought dragons were actually going to be real. And then finally experiencing them, we're experiencing what these characters are. And that's where I think you get this fantasy element, is through the character's experience, not necessarily.
And then.
If I could just build on that, to me the realism is, sadly, how much of this crazy stuff is real in our world.
Right.
Like torture. We like to think of torture as a medieval thing.
Right.
But it's not. It's a 20th and 21st century thing. And so is rape, and so is violence, and so is inequitable distributions of power. So when you get to the back to the premise of the discussion, when you get to the politics of all this, it is so sadly not at all fantasy.
No.
And it kind of makes us able to confront this in a way, like, we're so used to torture in society, it doesn't even shock us anymore. And this says, wait, torture is barbaric and medieval.
The fantasy kind of allows you to go places where a more realistic, a more conventionally realistic narrative set in a recognizably contemporary world wouldn't let you go. I think that's always the power of sort of gothic or unrealistic narratives. Yeah.
I think it's kind of interesting that they only give us as much realism as we can take. So in the middle of the arc, it's fine for Ramsay to be evil and torture everybody, right? And that's realistic. But then we always know in our hearts that at the end, he's going to get what's coming to him. Whereas in reality, maybe that doesn't happen. Maybe he lives another 50 years. But in the end, we know all the villains are going to die in the end. So.
Yeah, so it kind of makes a show of defying our desire for wish fulfillment, but ultimately it gives it to us at the end. Okay, yeah. You want to respond to that, or?
Yeah. I think maybe not necessarily with that example, because we were still within the scope of the books, but I do think that's one of the more unfortunate things about the writers being past George R.R. Martin's literature, is that people praised the Ned Stark decision because TV doesn't do that.
Right.
Like, you don't put somebody on a billboard and then kill them 9 episodes in, your biggest star, your biggest character.
Right.
And I think although it was daring for them even to follow through, because that was kind of set up as a successful literature model by George R.R. Martin, they had kind of a security blanket to do that. And I feel like now, because they don't have canon to kind of follow, we're seeing more of like a safe approach. And while I don't necessarily oppose like not as many people dying, when you see, especially when they went north of the wall this season, you see characters that you've never seen before, like clearly intended to just like, well, we need to have somebody die.
The red shirts.
We don't want it. We don't want it to be Beric. We don't want it to be any of these people.
Well, we bring back Thoros just so he can die.
And so I think the show has lost to a certain extent. Like there are still surprises, but I think it's lost to a certain extent that potential for us to leave that night, like literally
I think that's,
having no idea that was going to happen.
Bye, Travis.
I think that's part of the problem with like Jon Snow not being a bastard, right? We're starting to reach the point where those like arc drop-offs are gonna stop, and it just has to come to like the happy ending that we're all expecting. And I mean, if it doesn't, like maybe that's the ultimate success of the show. If we all leave the show sort of unsatisfied with whatever happened. I'm curious what you guys think about the White Walkers. We haven't talked about them
Yeah.
at all.
Just as a last thing, it's becoming more difficult, I think, to like shock us for like character-related things because, like, unlike the books, they haven't introduced nearly as many characters. They've been condensing a lot and saying we're going to skip that storyline in favor of this, and it just makes it a lot more difficult to pull things out of a hat when you have so few hats to pull out of.
But you know, they've still got John and Danny. You know, I mean, that was. They're still not. Yeah, I agree. They're pulling some punches at this point. You know, Jon Snow falling in the water, icy water, and then miraculously coming back again.
That episode was not my favorite.
But they're still willing to sort of embrace.
Have you guys heard of the theory that the White Walkers are an allegory for climate change?
Yeah.
That the idea is that everyone is so concerned about this sort of political infighting where in fact there's like this huge problem that is going to come down, climate change, which are the White Walkers.
Did you have it? Yeah.
So yeah, I didn't hear that necessarily that theory, but I saw one. It was pretty crazy that Bran is the Night King.
Right.
Oh yeah.
It's really like.
What's that based on? I mean, why does anybody think that?
It's based just like him.
Because he looks like him. That's it.
It's a really long background theory.
Okay. Yeah.
Right, there's like a few reasons for that. Like one person says like when Bran went back, not went back in time, like when he warred,
Right.
he like saw the whole White Walker army,
Uh-huh.
and the Night King was like the only person who could see him. Another theory is that like that's obviously he changed Hodor, like he's the reason why Hodor's like that.
Yeah.
So another theory is that like Bran eventually like their armies can't stop the White Walker army, so he has to go back and like stop it from the beginning. So he wards into the person who the children of the
Forest.
like stabbed, but he eventually winds up like going into that person, and he can't stop it, so he becomes the Night King. And I don't know if it's true.
Could
but
be.
Another part of it is that when the children in the forest are explaining to Bran about the war between men and the men, she doesn't say that they were fighting men. She says we were fighting you. And so it can be taken that she's addressing Bran.
And with the editing, it's
I've got a few believers here. And there's also a theory that the Tyrion is a Targaryen. That one seems
that's
more
more based
convincing.
on the book, I think, though.
And also the scene with the dragon.
Yeah. Is
And what-
Jon Snow going to ride a dragon?
Yes.
When the wall comes down too, the White Walkers cross the hole. They form the Stark Sigil. Like, so if you look at it, the pattern is a wall. While they cross the wall.
Easter egg.
I mean, the sigil is a medieval.
Yeah, the
thing.
heraldic badges. Yeah.
That's a medieval term I'd never heard before until like a few days ago.
Yeah.
They talk about it. I missed it in Game of Thrones.
No,
You
I
seem
was.
pregnant with thought. No. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Make
Well,
sure
thanks
you
for coming out. I
some
hope this
chicken
was
wings.
stimulating. Eat some chicken wings before you
some
go.
Valerian ale.
Maybe we should do this again next year after we've finally found out what actually.
2 years.
What?
Is it really?